and welcome to the next installment of the Analytics Excellence Certification course presented by Black Hills IP in association with the SLW Institute. Tom Marlowe can't be with us today, so he has asked me to join in his place. My name is Jacqueline Spratel, and I'm a patent analytics specialist for Black Hills IP, and I'm also an operations manager for Black Hills IP renewals. In a former life, I used to be in-house patent counsel for Thomson Reuters. I've had significant experience in my role there dealing with acquisitions and asset transfer and dealing with ownership issues. And in my current job, I do quite a lot of ownership analytics projects. And today I'm joined by Mark Stignani. Mark, you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. And just by way of expression, Jacqueline is also very much more skilled in analytics than many of the people I've worked with over the years, so I'm deeply honored to have her with me here. My own background also is I'm currently the practice chair for analytics here at Schwegman Lundberg Wosner. In a prior life, I also worked at Thomson Reuters as IP counsel, and I've also sat on a number of various and sundry analytics advisory panels over the years with different employers as well as different players in the analytics space. So been doing this for about 25 years. Glad to be here, and well, with that, I'll launch on into the next aspect of the webinar. Today we're really looking at ownership and ownership transfer analytics. And just like the rest of the other presentations, we are now kind of running, at least in the home stretch of the matters we're talking about in this fundamentals course. This is the third to the last, and we're following up here with prosecution, and this will be the prosecution analytics will be largely a U.S. Discussion, simply because it's the place where the data is most available. And then finishing up with the prior and white space analytics, which in my mind is probably the most interesting and probably the most difficult of all the chapters of the categories we're working through here, simply because there's so much basic engineering and assumptions that need to happen in that area. So once we're done with that, then we will present to everyone who's attended with a certification quiz, and then away we go, and full certifications will then be sent out to everybody. So thank you for bearing with us as we've gone through this. Much more interesting stuff to come, and as we'll go forward here. So this is the slide, the introductory slide from the first class, and with a couple little modifications. So we're talking about some interesting stuff here today, because ownership is a fairly nebulous and hard to extract aspect of patent analytics. In many cases, the original assignee, the original inventor, maybe the kind of the first and sometimes the only piece of information that you get in the national patent offices outside the U.S. And so discovery of assignments and discovery of who actually owns what becomes more and more prevalent of a problem as you get lots of companies combining, or you're buying and selling assets from different companies one to the other. So really teasing out the details makes it hard. So let's just go through some basic definitions. Inventor is the person who comes up with the idea that goes into the patent. Assignee, or applicant in the vernacular of international, is generally who owns the patent. So in general, the inventor will assign the invention to the assignee in most cases, and they are generally the holder of record in most databases. Now we're going to differentiate between current assignee, which is the one that we believe currently owns the asset, and the original assignee, which would be the original filer or the original applicant, which may or may not be anyone who has control over the asset anymore. But we use these as indicia of organic growth versus acquisitive growth, and we'll talk more about that going forward. Assignment chain, basically how has the chain of title transfer, since patents are very much like real property in the sense that they can be transferred, and we looked at different places for registrations that tell us when the assignment has changed hands and how it has changed and who it has changed hands to. And then another definition that I'm introducing here that was not introduced in the original slide deck is the whole notion of orphans and shell corporations. Now, two different things entirely. Orphans are basically patent assets that have been lost along the way through the chain of title. So the invention may have been registered in the name of another company, but through the course of acquisition or bankruptcy or disposal, the legal entity, which was the original and current assignee, has disappeared legally. And so you have what's called an orphan, which is a patent just kind of hanging out there in the ethos that one has a hard time learning or understanding who's actually in control of that asset, and you have to do various and odd steps to go find that orphan's ownership track, pass it. Now the shell company is the other side around. So with the advent of patent assertion entities or NPs or trolls or whatever term of art we use to describe people who buy and sell patents and litigate them, there was a very famous company called Intellectual Ventures, and a very famous person called Peter Detkin, who came up with the notion of creating shell ownership for various patent assets so that they are split amongst non-recognizable company entities, so that it's very hard and to determine who actually owns what in what aggregation for that. So this has been carried forward over the years. So the whole notion of discovering the owner of a shell or the making inferences to discover who is the the controller of the shell becomes a very interesting problem in this area. So now with the definitions, why does it matter? You can read that for yourself. What do we look for? We look for mistakes. We look for errors. We look for things that don't make sense from a qualitative standpoint. When do we do it? We do it all the time, but predominantly we do it in the M&A world. We do it a fair amount in the subcategory of the M&A is competitive behaviors. What are your competitors doing, and are they moving things around? This is very important, especially when you're looking at kind of discovering the corporate structure of a competitive patent owner in the marketplace. Valuation, assertion, licensing, et cetera, all those sorts of things that we get into as we're doing this. Who actually owns an asset is a very important question to answer, and sometimes, in fact, many times, very, very difficult. So I will start moving into some examples which hopefully illustrate some of these points. So moving right along, this is just a screenshot, oops, two screenshots back. This is a screenshot of, as you can probably tell, Medtronic's portfolio as it was captured in time, I think, pre-COVIDian here. So as you can see, the ownership data breaks down in a number of different places. You have everything from an LLC, which might be an exposition, to the limited partnerships and SARLs, which are also limited liability companies outside the U.S. And so we see a great deal of breakdown. Medtronic MiniMed, for instance, would be an acquisition. Medtronic AVE would be a joint venture that they put together. So you start to get an immediate kind of picture for what sort of corporate structure the IP assets are assigned to as you're going into this. And you can see kind of, if you were to look up only Medtronic and take all the different variations of Medtronic, you would still miss things because you have, unless you could find out that Kyphon and Orthophoenix were Medtronic assets, just under a different name change. So this is one of the first problems we run into in ownership analytics clarification, is that ownership is very hard to track down to kind of a common entity because the names change, and a lot of the software out there, and being on commercial systems as we go into this, they don't do a good job figuring out who owns what in such a way that I can trust it and move forward into analytics. Another interesting slide of portfolio ownership is I've moved over to the Lattice Semiconductor Corporation, which was recently just denied sale to China, as it had been predicted before. But in this case, you can start to see that they've got a fair number of relationships based upon joint ownership or joint licensure of assets back and forth. Some of them are, as you'll find, are related to litigation. Some of them are related to research. So like, for instance, University of Kentucky Foundation has 9 jointly shared matters with Lattice Semiconductor. And you can kind of begin to work your way through this and start to get hints and nuances of what's in a portfolio. So what you're seeing here is really a merger or a discovery of both original and current assignee, so that we can kind of look at these individual matters explicitly to kind of understand what the relationship is. So this is one early example of how you can discover company relationships, joint venture relationships, litigation relationships that may have resulted in a settlement agreement that had cross-licensing or cross-ownership, in fact, of various patent matters. Jackie?
And Mark, if I could actually just add to that, sometimes when you see this in Lattice, this is one example, but there are times when I would take a look at this list and possibly look at it from, this is a bit of a noisy set of chain of title. So it could be very possible that, you know, if a certain asset went through multiple acquisitions, that maybe an assignment wasn't filed, and so it looks like there's 2 current owners at the USPTO or whatever PTO this data is from, and it kind of gives you an indication of, okay, we also might need to go back and clean up chain of title if that's the project you're working on as well.
Absolutely, and so Jackie is absolutely right. If you put these things forward as there's some smoke here, but you really have to start to step into it to see where the fire is. Moving to another example of thing, we also want to look at the legal status here, because the status timeline is also fantastically useful in discovering kind of what actually happened to this. So as you can see down at the bottom here, MiniMed was apparently an independent company. It had actually, over the course of time, used this as a capital asset, and there was essentially a security interest filed at the USPTO by US Capital, or ING actually. And then that was also then later transferred under the acquisition to Medtronic. Now what we don't actually see here is the release of that assignment in this thing. So again, we should be looking to make sure, if we're doing due diligence on this particular asset, we want to make sure that the security interests have been formally released and registration has occurred. So one of the things that one would go into this type of ownership cleanup is you want to make sure that there are no existing liens or security interests held on a particular matter, and you get your first inkling that something's available and capable of being shared or actually sold as a result of it.
Yeah, and Mark, I do want to just kind of add on to that as well, is there are times when if you try to go pull data in bulk, that you may see that the current owner for something is, back to your point, Capital LLC. While they do have a security interest, there are some people who would say they are not the current owner. So if you are looking to a service and they will provide you with an ownership list, you may get some false positives as to who the current owner is. So it's always good not to just take the data at face value, but to really look at the whole chain and see what each conveyance is and what it's telling you as well.
And for completeness sake, the USPTO is not the only place where security interests are registered, and sometimes you will find the security interests registered elsewhere in the state lien or other place rather than the USPTO. So it is not 100% certain that when you're doing an impairment or a review of the aspects that have transpired on the asset transfer side, you may actually have to go to a number of sources to get there. So, and then also it helps to look at the inventor. So I introduced the concept of direct pivots and soft or indirect pivots throughout the teaching of this series. And so I show you one of the more notable inventors out there, Kevin Rivette, who his assignment history rather than work history is shown out here. And one of the things that you can start to discover when you're looking at various inventors who have things in common, you can start to find things like this Rosebud Software and FPOSA-HU LLC to be interesting pieces of data that we look for especially if you have a sense for that that person being involved in shell companies or orphan companies. So it helps you to then soft pivot company ownership as well with the kind of inventors that you see in an organization. As you can see there, what appears to be here is that there was a significant overlap in his inventions during a relatively contemporaneous period of time. So it would at least behoove you to check the second, at least the second and third source as to what these companies were, what were his commitments based upon his employment agreements, so forth and so on. And those, because you can see that 3 of these companies, essentially, or 4 of these companies actually overlap in invention assignment during those periods of time. So also another big question to ask, was the inventor on a particular set of matters entitled to give that ownership to a certain company, and discover that backwards. So I don't have any personal knowledge of Kevin Rivette's assignment world, but it would be an area I think that I would certainly ask for should I be doing diligence on the portfolio. So let's just talk about, I kind of mentioned the problems with commercial sources of data. There are 3 primary sources of problems that I've come up across using commercial systems, trying to understand who owns what when it comes to patent portfolios. The first is ownership authority files. It is excruciatingly difficult for commercial systems to keep on top of all the mergers, acquisitions, disposals, abandonments, name changes, and such that happen to assets as they travel through the year. Most of the systems that I'm aware of don't update their authorities as to who owns what, or what are the names of companies associated with a particular parent corporation. More than monthly, most of them do it only yearly. And so during the course of the year, you can have 5 or 6 really significant acquisitions that will suddenly and be absolutely material to a discussion about the competitive nature of a company. And the commercial systems won't respond to this adequately or correctly. So it also doesn't seem to be an area of concern for them, because I raise the issue on a fairly frequent basis that they don't update these things often enough. It also doesn't seem, as Jackie had mentioned, to distinguish collateral agreements, because in many cases I will get a result back showing that I've got a Goldman Sachs or a JP Morgan or some essentially a company lending money as the primary owner, when all you have is a security interest on that. So in many cases, I don't think they spend a lot of time working in that environment. It doesn't seem to involve the organization to the degree that it's important, at least when I'm doing data work. So also, the official sources don't seem to be 100% or not accurate, because in many cases you will find that a lot of owners of patents don't change the assignment of record as you're going through it. So you kind of need to supplement, and then given most commercial systems that I'm aware of do not do this, and they fail at it. So if you're getting the sense here that I think a lot of hand review of things is necessary in ownership analytics, it absolutely is. So I mean, my go-to place is I look for through all the commercial liens databases just to see what is held in a commercial lien on top of at the state level, predominantly here, but what is held as a commercial lien. What do the SEC records say about who's lending the who are they taking loans from, the line of credits? In litigation records, you can kind of figure out what is useful and what is distinctively the parties of interest when you're looking at that in the docket records. A lot of companies do a lot of press releases. I spend a lot of time on their website and seeing what they self-report. Social networks is a surprisingly good area to discover when people are owned distinctly and differently, because an inventor, if you pull them up on the social network, may self-report that they're working for a different company that you can actually see, or that they were purchased by a company. So there's a lot of what I would call private information on social networks that people put in place. And again, WIPO, PCT, EU A lot of their records may have additional hints and aspects that I go into to double check what I've got is, make sure it's accurate. Also, as you are going through this, I want to make sure that everybody, if you have questions, please have, type your questions along here. We'll try to answer them as we go. But anything that I try to cover as many of those, we tend to run out of time. So let's talk about a key methodology that I think is important if you're going to do complete ownership analysis. I run this portfolio that I'm looking at through 2 commercial systems. I look for everything in common, so I work very hard to make sure that I find at least 2 systems that agree that this is a membership, membership of the asset. I then go backfill and I look at all the family members above and beyond of what portfolio has been requested at, because a lot of times the portfolio may not even know about family members. So that's important for discovering orphans. It's also important for discovering whether or not different assignees belong to different members. So then you can move that together. I move everything that disagrees with the two past commercial system thing to a separate review set. I also then review for misspellings and missed assets and things that the normalization of the 2 systems don't catch. As I mentioned earlier, I go back to SEC for statements of ownership and statements of transfer, review company news Wikipedia, look for other, we go back and research any new names I find there as potentially owned. A lot of times commercial systems will disagree whether or not a particular matter has been transferred or not. And so there's an aspect of that when you're running commercial systems that you have to somehow resolve those ownership things. I mean, ultimately in the U.S. I go back to PAIR, or I go back to whatever official source is there, because you have to rely as much as you can on what the official record says. I go back and look at litigation. So if they've been involved in any IP litigation, especially on the assertion side, they have to place all their interested parties into the record. So we look for other names and organizations that may have an interest in litigation. As I mentioned, LinkedIn. Then you spend a lot of time cross-referencing and correlating. So you may be looking at 4 to 5 systems at any one time just to correlate this. And if this sounds really hard, it is. There's nothing out there that really does a great job. The best taxonomy I've ever used probably came in at about 90% accuracy. And then the frequency of update on that has been since declined to a kind of an annual update on it. So I have no good places, no people to recommend in that respect as to what the best system is to use. I try to use 2 or more if it's a really important review. So I talked about pivots. These, when we're looking at ownership, I try to keep my direct pivots to the short 3, as we've talked about earlier. But then I start normalizing the things using, are the inventors the same? Do all the family members belong? Do the commercial liens also agree with the security interests? And so I try to basically keep using these things as cascading filters or pivots that would allow me to then find groups of data that I can trust and speak to reliably, and then I have a bunch of wobbly stuff that I have to go back and try to find other measures and pivots to validate for my client. So just as you're going through this, think about what we can kind of look at as a pivot first of all, but then we move into an indirect pivot very quickly to find other things going on in it. So with that, let's talk through a little bit of examples. What I would mention acquisition and organic. So we use original assignee as a proxy for organic as well as current assignee. So the basic rule of thumb, if your original assignee is the same name as your current assignee, it's an organic thing. If it's not, it's likely acquired. Now, there's some nuances here. We also try to make sure that the inventors are also with the current assignee, because if the inventors and the current assignee both agree from the original point of time to now. In general, we can pretty much feel safe that that's an organically extracted piece of invention. So why is this important? And I'll let you read a lot more of this. Let's talk about why this is important. A lot of times we're asked to evaluate the organic growth capacity or the organic intellect, I guess, of the inventorship of a company. And if we see a company that has very few original assignee and original inventors, we can kind of make some judgments about what their own interest in intellectual property is based upon their own organic registration of IP. The larger the amount of acquisitive growth, then we can start to look at a timeline of what they've acquired and try to correlate that back with new product announcements or change of ownership, change of leadership. So we can kind of start to tease out the inventive story, the innovation story for a company that we're analyzing. So this is most important, especially when we're talking about competitive behavioral trends, is we can start to look at when somebody got to the gospel or the religion of IP. I mean, Twitter is a great example of that. Yahoo and Facebook both had different stories and timelines of what they had versus what they acquired. I mean, Facebook got sued by Yahoo over some early time internet patents, and then Facebook got religion and bought a big portfolio. They successfully sued Yahoo back and got out of that case, but they've been on a tear ever since. So this is another really fun way to tease out what is the organic, inventive, or innovative intent of a company as you're doing the analytics here. There's other reasons you can do this here. As you're starting to harvest things out, things that can come out by having different assignees, but if they're the same name, a lot of times we'll see companies moving assets around for the basis of tax services. You can discover, by looking at the last name or the appendage on the company name, whether it's ULC for a limited liability company, LLCs, organized in Nevada, or a number of other types of really interesting stuff that comes out of the entity extraction. When you start to see related entity names and they're in a certain jurisdiction or locale, you can extract where their R&D centers are. You can extract where they're moving revenue to get good tax planning from it. And you can also start to identify dual ownership or joint ventureship in that respect. So the whole nuance of acquisition versus organic analysis can be very, very useful when you're trying to understand the reasoning for some company's behavior and growth in a particular area of IP. All right, let's then jump over to some examples here. I've been talking about competitive behavior analytics. So we do this literally every day, every week here on the job here at Schwegman. We're looking at companies. We're looking to trying to figure out as I mentioned earlier, the innovation story, who the partnerships they may have, who they're working with for enforcement, all sorts of things like that. So as you're getting into the extraction process here, it isn't just the assignments, but you have to take the assignments of past acquisitions. I tend to look back between 5 and 10 years in the acquisitions when I'm looking at a competitor to make sure that are they sloppy with their IP? Do they don't fix things? I'm looking for misspellings. I'm looking for things that family members that may be assigned to a different company, whether that's through an error of the patent office or through the law firm working on things or not. I also tend to look at the inventors of the current companies. I try to go back and look at the past companies' inventors. So a lot of times how an inventor moves from company to company, as we showed earlier with the Kevin Rivett example, it gives you at least a nuance or an inference to make about, are they losing their top talent? Is their top talent going somewhere as a competitor? Are they breaking off, starting their own startup? What are they doing? There's a concept I haven't really written down here, but it's called co-inventorship. Who they invent with is another useful thing to find out whether or not do they normally co-invent with an individual works for a university or another company, or is there a parent-distributor relationship? There's lots of things that inventor data can go through. I also like to harvest the locations of the inventors, because that will give you a lot of sense for where their true R&D is happening, their true innovation is happening. And if they're all in one place and the company's owning it elsewhere outside that country, then it's also a particular indicator of a tax entity. I extract technology classes because one of the things that, especially when you're trying to discover shell companies, is that sometimes they may have entirely different assignments, they have entirely different vendors, but the technology classes tend to be related. Also, who does their work? Both in this, when I say company agents, I mean who are the law firms they use. Also, who are the corporate representatives? Who incorporates the company? Who's listed as company secretary? Because that's one thing, especially when you're getting into different groups and shells, is you have the same company agent or the same company representative listed in a number of different companies. It's a great way to pivot around, figuring out all the companies that they might have, also as you're thinking about shells. Litigation, as I mentioned earlier, tends to have a lot of interesting information about the current status of the company during the time of litigation, so you can harvest out aspects of that as well. Let's see here. Other things that I have seen in data extract here, it's just really whatever data you can get and whatever timeline you get. So as we're getting competitors together and kind of bring them into kind of filling out what is their corporate structure, where are their inventors located, who are they most likely to utilize. You're just trying to figure out every possible piece of data that you can bring together and see where the patents have gone to, whether it's a tax entity, in the case of Red Rock, an enforcement entity, a joint partnership, whether it's university relationships or not. And also another thing to kind of look for is when a company is in distress. So what you can do when you're looking at, and I put Rose Blush up there as an example because I do have some information on that company. It went to IV. But what happens a lot of times when you see a competitor go into distress, you will see, as mentioned earlier, abandonments. You will see lots of abandonments. You may see a sudden drastic change in counsel. You can see that they went from a top 5 IP law firm to some guy who's operating out of his house. It doesn't necessarily directly speak to quality, but it does speak to a lot of change happening at the organization. You can make some judgments about cost cutting when the portfolio takes a turn that's not expected. You can see abandonment, or if there's a sudden donation to a university, you can use that as implying that they're getting out of a marketplace. So there's a lot of nuance that I want to emphasize nuance because you have to go elsewhere to find this there. But a lot of times you will have 6 months to 2 years advance notice by looking at the IP and how they've been treating it, as to whether or not a company is going to go up for sale or not, or it's going to go under, or it's having financial difficulties. If you suddenly see a large number of security interests get registered for a portfolio, then you can pretty much get stuck going for another round of financing or loan authorization. So you have to pay for growth, but if there's no news releases on the growth, then you have another mystery to unravel. Why are they borrowing money if they're not making big press release announcements about that money going forward? So this is probably the 800-pound gorilla of ownership analytics. It's really kind of using this and the movement of those assets around to tease out what's going on. Example 2, acquisitions. A lot of times, especially when acquisitions are happening in a hurry, the IP counsel are, in many cases, tasked to make some judgments on an IP portfolio. in a very, very short amount of time, under a couple of weeks. So what we can do when we spend time looking at ownership analytics, I see a fair amount of organizational mistakes and that sort of stuff, especially when it's a smaller company. So again, we go back to the same data we're extracting. We extract past acquisitions. We look for orphans. We look for related locations. Do they have all the inventors? Did the inventors leave? We look at the technology classes they're in. We try to figure out, and this is one case where we have the employment agreements in place. So we try to extract every employment agreement in the sense that, did any of these inventors not sign something? So, so when we're doing acquisition analysis, we can do due diligence in a very short amount of time by looking at just this type of thing. So it tells us what we don't need to look at. So if everything is well assigned and it's correctly transferred and it's registered accordingly, there's no security interest, we can set that aside largely until they start asking this question: is this of any value? But then we look for what's impaired. We start to see security interests. We know we have to go out to other lien places where liens are registered and take a look for that. We start seeing inventors who've left and are doing the same thing for another company. We have to make the decision: did that inventor potentially take a trade secret or what with them? So we want to make sure that those assets, it might just be the paper itself, but the inventor's left and all the kind of the invented firepowers with a competitor. We look for unassigned or reserved IP. So a lot of times when I get into a data room, the IP that I find in the public is not in the data room. And so you have to do this discussion with them as though, I found this, what's this about? And their answer generally is, well, that's not on the block, that's not on the on sale block, or it's not assigned to the company, and so you have this kind of dance that goes back and forth with the organization. So there is a fairly good chance, especially if you're buying a smaller company or a company that hasn't got good control of its IP processes, that there may be some assigned or reserved IP out in there. We also look for, if we start to see products, especially where, in some cases you'll see them doing a press release and saying something is patented, and if you can't find the IP related to that in the public, then you have to start to figure out whether, well, are they not telling us the truth about technology being patented, or is this something that's merely in the works or something? So it starts you on to this discussion as to, well, you say this and I can't find this. Where is it? Is this undisclosed? What other types of undisclosed inventions do you have? So I mean, there's literally 50 to 60 different inferences that you have to kind of tease out once you're doing an acquisition analysis. And one of the hardest things to do is take a relatively good sized portfolio and compare that against the product line and make judgments about whether or not the assets are impaired, let alone make judgments about whether the assets are of any quality or not. So this helps us sort the piles of assets that we're looking at, especially in the patent world, into manageable bunches, the ones that we don't even know we don't know when our question is, have we answered everything under the sun that we're looking for? So.
And Mark, I wanted to add as well to this is you kind of have come at it from the standpoint of if you're doing the acquisition analysis, and I know you and I have never had this experience where the acquisition's already happened, and the M&A counsel says, yeah, no, that analysis all got done by seller's counsel. So here you go, and you're supposed to just take it for what it's worth as well. So in my experience, while that's great, sometimes you almost have to redo this legwork and do this analysis post-acquisition to find all of these inferences and things as well. So while you can't maybe do that during the acquisition because it's done, you can at least still have that contact, and then you can reach back out to them and say, hey, I have a few questions to just follow up. Because a lot of the times in a merger and acquisition, IP can sometimes not be at the forefront. It's just kind of an afterthought, and the analysis was not well done on that.
Absolutely, and so I think that is a really good point, because I mean, if you come to a portfolio, say, post-acquisition, in many cases you will find a strong reticence on probably both parties to go back and try to figure out what else was missed, because you know, it's a hard thing to do as you go into this stuff, and you can create a lot of bad karma for the portfolio if you find that there's something left out there that someone else can then snatch up and impair the portfolio that, you know, theoretically had everything in it. So absolutely, Jacqueline, that is without a doubt one of the nightmare scenarios of acquisition analysis. And so let's move on here to another example. So ownership cleanup. So this is a nice dovetail into what Jacqueline was just talking about. A lot of times when you end up as counsel in a company that has an acquisitive heritage, and if you're one of the early number of counsel in there, you can find that the ownership of all the assets is really unclear. If you're doing, especially if you're looking at a company that has bought and merged a number of different times, a number of different companies, you may actually find that the past acquisition entity no longer exists. So, and truth be told, a lot of times in-house counsel don't want to spend the money to get that all fixed up, because there's no internal benefit to have that done correctly until some sort of event happens, whether it's company's up for sale, company's going to start asserting its patent portfolio, you're looking at, you know, removing or monetizing value out of that portfolio. So a lot of times these errors sit, and some of that is the budgetary. I mean, a lot of it's budgetary, but I think some of it's also it's very hard for an internal counsel to make the argument to the rest of the organization that we need to fix everything and make it clean with no imminent need to happen. So in many cases, if I'm doing this analysis, there has been an event that I'm reacting to at a client, and the client is going to say, well, we just need to make sure our portfolio is clean. So we go into this with essentially the same, you know, eye for it, but in this case we have a lot more kind of internal data, so we don't have to look to these extrinsic sources nearly as much. We do make things, you know, we do look at the lean resources as well, because a lot of times you will find that previous owners, previous managers of the IP portfolio have not done a great job keeping that to a low roar. So we, you know, this is I think an easier job too, but it's no less tricky, because in some cases you have to actually resurrect entities and create secretaries of those entities for the purpose of making that asset transfer happen. It's you know, it's a fairly common occurrence. So, and so again, I would always advise the hiring of good business counsel as well, to make sure anything like that is done correctly and in a way that's not impeachable going forward, but you have a real difficult problem to fix sometimes.
Yeah, and Mark, on that, it's almost a little kind of spin on this. I have done several analyses and come up with your counsel filed all the right assignments, but somehow a different company used possibly sloppy counsel, and suddenly their assignment is on your patent. And so I've had several projects where I've had to kind of point those out, and then that company and our customer had to write letters to you know, those companies saying, you know, you filed an erroneous assignment on, you know, our assets, and can you please clean this up? Now, some companies don't go that far, but I have seen that as well, that, you know, you may do everything right, but your chain of title still may look sloppy because of other people filing assignments and getting the, you know, application number swapped or patent number swapped. And the patent office, USPTO, doesn't really do any double checks to make sure that that is the assignment, that is the record the assignment should be attached to. They just pretty much take it at face value and file it against anything.
Okay, I've just gotten some background noise into my system as well here, so can everybody hear me still? Send me a note or a question if you can't. I'll continue to move on here. So the final example we have, and then we can close and do some closing here, is that orphan and shell identification. This is just another variation of the problem in front of us here. Again, we take this to a high degree of hand analysis, simply because we have the operational problem here of people trying to either, or you have entities that don't exist anymore in the case of an orphan, or in the case of a shell, you have people purposely trying to obfuscate the outcome here. So what we're trying to come up with here is we're trying to find out the inferential stuff that allows us to get forward here. It looks like we've still got background noise here in the system, so we'll try a couple things here, see if we have a change on it. So, well, I've got a few more minutes here, so let me just kind of run through this with the background noise in place here. So, the important point of this educational process is that by pulling all these various aspects of data and starting to pivot around various aspects of the data, you can get to there we go, the noise is gone. You can get to a point where you can start to find commonalities to, identify, especially in the case of shell, company shells. So I'll speak, I think I spoke mostly the orphans previously, so I'll speak most of the shells here in the remaining minutes. The whole idea of finding shell companies is that, in general, companies do not change who they use for counsel. They do not change where the inventors are located, and they generally will keep to the same area of technology development. So if you pull all the assignments out with all the same similar technology classes and all have the same law firms in play, or a definable set of law firms in play, you can start to extrapolate who may be the common owner in play. So we see this in a couple different instances, with the NPEs or the patent, kind of the patent pirates that are put out there. You can kind of go backwards and see where things came from. In the case where you have a shell company that is basically represented, a very useful thing is to take a pivot table on a spreadsheet of all the agents that you can find, of all the company names you can find, and just look for the patterns of what other companies have that same pattern. We've also seen this on the trademark side, where we've discovered companies registering brands in the name of other companies and testing them out before they bring the brand in-house. So it's not just a patent thing. So as we're going through this discovery of shell companies, it's all inferential, because a lot of times the organization is very heavily obscured, but they have common pivot points, again, of counsel, of location, and tech classes. So sorry for the background noise, everybody. Just some final thoughts here before we start to get into the close, so we can open for questions. The key takeaway, whoops, try that again. The key takeaways here is that there's no one good data source. There's no one good commercial system. Do not believe anyone if they tell you they've got ownership, kept in check or kept in play here. It just isn't true. Detailed human analysis will give you a much better answer than relying upon any one system. The common thing that inventors, agents, and organizations is a very important triumvirate of organizational data to make sure you correlate, because the correlation of they can change the names of the organizations, but they can't really change the inventors. and they don't really seem to want to change their law firms very much. So towards the end of this, ownership analytics is more of a practice than it is a science at this point, simply because of the ability to, not have totally correct data as you go through things. So with that, I will close here to let people type questions if you'd like. Otherwise, I do thank you for your time and your interest, and hopefully we will see you as we come forward in this. So Jackie, do you have any questions or thoughts?
That was very informative. No, good. I agree with you. These analyses, I think there's a lot of people who
think this is really straightforward. You're just trying to find the ownership of these or verify the ownership, or but it's just not as straightforward as people think, and you and I have done plenty of these to know that. But I hope that'd be my takeaway, is it's just never as straightforward as you think, and there's always some further investigations and layers to keep digging on to make sure that you really see the full picture of kind of whatever the project is you're doing around ownership.
And I notice we have a lot of analysts on the registration list here. So one of the things that always budget extra time for this sort of analysis, because I've never seen something that works as straightforward as it goes. So I am not seeing any questions coming in. Give it a minute or two more, but I do apologize for the background noise, and hopefully that we can get other questions in there. Also, both Jacqueline and I are readily available on LinkedIn. We do welcome your questions any way we can help to make this presentation or this type of certification better. It is our hope to make this, now that we've got a basic certification course out of the way here, that we will get into some really more workshop-y type analytics, and teaching people how to really get about doing their own analytics in a more precise and deep way. There are these higher level courses. So hopefully you'll hang on here, but thank you very much. And I don't see any more questions come in, so I appreciate your attention. Thank you.